The autumn wind cut through my black dress as I stood at my son's grave, holding my grandsons close. 8-year-old David trembled beside me, trying not to cry while his younger brother Danny hid his face in my skirt. I thought grief had already taken everything from me until my daughter-in-law walked toward us with a manila folder in her hands. "Keep the kids," she said coldly. "I want the beach house and the company." Those words hit harder than the sound of dirt falling on my son's coffin. I didn't know it then, but that moment would define the next 20 years of our lives. Michael had been my only child, my pride, and the reason I worked double shifts at the hospital. He'd built his own construction company from scratch, married a woman named Sarah, who dazzled him with charm and given me 2 beautiful grandsons. But on that gray autumn afternoon, Sarah stood 15 feet away from his grave checking her phone. Even at her husband's funeral, she couldn't summon grief. When the service ended, she approached with those custody papers like she was closing a business deal. "You should take them," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "They need stability, and I need freedom." Freedom, as it turned out, meant money. She wanted the beach house, Michael's company, and every cent of his estate. I hesitated for only a moment, then signed. I couldn't risk losing the boys to her indifference. That night, as I tucked them into bed in my tiny apartment, I whispered a promise to their father's spirit. I would raise them with love, even if it meant starting over at 59. The following weeks were a blur of exhaustion and heartbreak. The boys cried for their mother each night, and I rocked them until my arms ached. During the day, I worked long hours at the hospital and did my best to stretch my paycheck to cover school supplies and secondhand clothes. When I reached out to Michael's lawyer, James Morrison, he confirmed what I already feared legally. Sarah owned everything. She'd inherited Michael's estate and signed away all financial responsibility for her children. I was raising them alone. Then one afternoon, about a month later, the phone rang. Joyce came, her airy voice cheerful and detached. "I just wanted to let you know I'll be traveling for a while." I could hear laughter and music behind her. She didn't even ask to speak to her sons. "The boys miss you," I said quietly. "They ask about you every day." "Children are resilient," she replied. "They'll adjust." And then she was gone off to Paris, New York, Cabo. Her social media, which I checked against my better judgment, showed a woman reborn in luxury. Meanwhile, I was taking extra shifts and learning to cook cheap meals that stretched across 3 days. But somehow we managed. The boys grew stronger. David was fiercely protective of Danny, and Danny, gentle and thoughtful, had a way of softening every hard day. Months turned into years. Sarah sold the beach house within 2 months of Michael's death and unloaded his company soon after. I thought that would be the end of her reach into our lives. But David never forgot what she'd done. One night, at just 8 years old, he whispered to me, "When I grow up, I'll buy back Daddy's house." I smiled, then thinking it was only a dream. But that dream would one day come true in ways I couldn't imagine. 7 years later, the boys had become young men. David, at 15, was already reading business books and taking college classes part-time. Danny, 13, wanted to be a veterinarian and spent weekends helping at the animal shelter. Our apartment walls were covered in their drawings, awards, and photos. Life was modest but full. Then one evening, David came rushing in with a newspaper. "Grandma," he said breathlessly, "the beach house is for sale again." He looked at me with eyes that were all Michael's. "I told you I'd buy it back someday." David began working part-time at a grocery store, saving every dollar, and started a small business refurbishing old computers. Within a year, his company, David's Tech Solutions, was making enough to pay our bills and even help Danny with his school expenses. "If I keep growing," he told me proudly, "I can buy the beach house by 25. His determination both inspired and worried me. I'd seen what greed could do to people, but I trusted him. His drive came not from greed, but from love and the need to restore what had been taken from us. By 17, David's name was spreading in local business circles. That's when a woman named Margaret Ashford showed up at our door. She represented a corporation called Coastal Development Group and wanted to buy David's company. "We'd pay you more than you've ever dreamed," she said smoothly. but something in her tone felt wrong, rehearsed. She knew details she shouldn't about our past, about the beach house, about Sarah. 2 days later, my fears were confirmed when Danny came home from school saying Jimmy's mom said an Irish lady's been asking questions about us. My blood ran cold. Sarah was back. 8 years after she'd walked away, she called. "Joyce, it's me," she said softly. "I need to see the boys. It's been too long." Her voice carried something new, desperation. She claimed she'd changed, that she wanted to make amends, but I'd learned to listen beneath her words. "Why now?" I asked. "Does it matter?" she replied. "I just want to make things right." I agreed to dinner, though David's jaw tightened when I told him. "She's not coming back because of guilt, Grandma," he said flatly. "She's coming back because she needs something." He was right. When Sarah arrived the next evening, she looked older, worn down. Her designer polish had faded, replaced by worry lines and forced smiles. Dinner was painfully awkward. She asked rehearsed questions about the boys' success, her eyes gleaming when she heard about David's business. Later, when the boys cleared the table, she pulled me aside and whispered, "I'm in trouble, Joyce. I owe people a lot of money. I need help. Just a loan, $2 million. I stared at her, unable to believe the audacity. "And you thought the children you abandoned would bail you out." Before I could say more, David stepped into the room. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Sarah began. "I just need some help." "You mean money," he said. "You lost everything again, didn't you?" She froze. "How did you?" "Because I pay attention," he replied coldly. "To everything." David didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the table between us. Sarah's eyes lit with hope as she pulled out the contents, then drained as she realized they weren't checks. Deeds, incorporation papers, filings, and at the top a glossy photograph of a familiar shore. "I bought the beach house back," David said evenly, "and I rebuilt what you sold of Dad's company, piece by piece, contract by contract. It took years, but I finished last month." She stared at the photograph like it might burn her. You can't." "That house was Dad's dream," he replied. "You traded dreams for handbags and plane tickets. I traded my adolescence for a plan." He turned to me then, and I recognized Michael's steadiness in his posture. "Grandma, the keys and transfer documents are in the envelope. The house and the company belong to you, not as a gift, but as a restoration of what should have been yours." I could only press a hand to my mouth. He had promised at 8 years old. He had kept it as a man. Sarah's breath came quick and shallow. "You took advantage," she whispered. "You waited until I was vulnerable, then you know," Danny said from the doorway, voice quiet but unblinking. "We waited until we were strong enough to stop you from using us again." Sarah's gaze snapped to him, searching for softness. She found a spine of steel instead. $2 million, she said at last, the number leaving her lips like a final gambit. "That's what I owe. There are people who do not accept payment plans." David finished calm, as if reading a report. "We are not your creditors or your cover. We are the children you left on a stranger's couch the day you cashed in our father's life." She flinched, and for a breath I saw something true flicker behind her eyes, regret perhaps, or the faintest horror at herself. Then the calculation returned. "I'm still your mother," she said. "Family helps family. Family shows up," I answered before the boys could. "Family stays." She reached for the envelope again, maybe to tear it, maybe to plead, but David laid a second document atop the table. "You should read this one, too." Her lips moved as she took in the legal language. The color left her face. "A restraining order." "Filed this morning," he said not unkindly. 500 feet. No calls, no surprise visits, no messages through third parties. You can contact our attorney if you have legitimate legal business. We're done improvising pain in living rooms. How could you, she managed. I gave you life. You gave us a lesson, Danny said while rinsing dishes. He hadn't stopped washing through the entire storm. That love is not a feeling you visit when it's convenient. It's a practice you show up for when it costs you. Sarah's chair scraped the floor. She lifted her suitcase like it weighed more than the $2 million she did not have. At the door, she turned once more, searching the three of us for someone to rescue the version of herself she preferred. No one moved. She left without slamming the door, which somehow felt sadder. The apartment exhaled. We stood in a silence that was not empty, but clean like a room you have finally decided to claim. That night, David spread the timeline of his long plan across our small kitchen table. I saw years arranged in neat, relentless rows, summer jobs and balance sheets, the first refurbished computer sold to a neighbor, a spreadsheet predicting when the beach house might resurface, contacts cultivated at the bank, a quiet trail of share purchases in companies Sarah bragged about online, a refused buyout from Coastal Development Group with a clause that would have muzzled him for a decade. I never wanted to become her, he said. So every time I earned, I asked myself what Dad would build with it. Every time I planned, I asked myself what would keep Danny safe and you steady. He tapped the deed. Reclaiming the house was the line. Rebuilding the company was the promise. The rest is guardrails to keep us from ever having to live at someone else's mercy again. We drove to the beach the next morning, the three of us quiet in a way that felt reverent rather than strained. The moment I stepped onto the porch, time folded. The navy curtains Michael had hung were back. The worn leather chair where he'd read the Sunday paper waited by the window, restored but not replaced. On the mantel sat the crooked seashell frame David made in 3rd grade, and a photo I didn't know he'd saved. Michael sunburned and laughing with a small David on his shoulders, and Danny clapping in a sand-speckled diaper. How I asked, touching the frame with a fingertip. Weekends, David said. We came while you worked. Contractors followed the old photos. We matched wood grain paint codes, even the hum of the refrigerator model Dad loved. I wanted it to feel like you could set down your keys and hear his whistle from the hall. As if summoned, the ocean answered in its old voice. Danny opened windows. Salt wind threaded the rooms. I sat in Michael's chair and let my bones remember happiness. It terrified me how naturally it returned. Grief loosened slowly like a sailor, untying a stubborn knot. Love slips back in, through any window you leave, cracked. I'm proud of you, I said, because words must do odd small work when the heart is too full. Not for the things, though I am grateful, for what you refuse to become. David crouched beside the chair. There's more, he said, almost shy now that the hard part was done. He showed me a set of documents that restructured ownership of the company into a trust with my name on it, and a mission baked into its charter to build dignified, affordable homes for single mothers and grandparents raising grandchildren. Profits capped dividends cycled into expansion governance tied to community boards. Business should serve people, he said simply. Dad taught me that without using those words. Danny slid a folder onto my lap. And this is the clinic plan. Low-cost veterinary care for families who otherwise surrender pets when life breaks. We'll start with mobile vans. It's cheaper and we can go where people are. We worked until evening, not with hammers, but with memories assigning them to corners, letting them claim shelves. When the light softened over the water, I cooked dinner in a kitchen that had been waiting for me all these years. We ate at the old table and no one mentioned Sarah. The house held us without judgment, like it understood that some stories are too heavy to say before dessert. News reached us a week later, not from gossip, but from the paper David still read in print. Coastal Development Group, the would-be buyer of my grandson's first company, had filed for bankruptcy after a failed luxury resort ran afoul of environmental law. In the same column, smaller but sharper, a note. Federal authorities were reviewing associated investor activity for potential fraud and tax irregularities. David didn't smile. He just folded the paper with care. Consequences, he said, as if naming weather. The phone rang that night. A lawyer introduced himself politely and asked on behalf of Sarah whether we might be willing to consider temporary housing assistance. David thanked him for the call, gave him our attorney's name, and hung up. Then he wiped down the counter and set the kettle on as if nothing important had happened, and perhaps nothing had. The past had finally learned how to knock. 6 months later, the world learned what we already suspected. News outlets reported that Sarah O'Brien, once the glamorous widow of a construction magnate, had been arrested on charges of fraud tax, evasion, and embezzlement tied to false property investments. I didn't gloat when I read it. I just felt still. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely comes with fanfare. It comes like quiet balance after a long storm. "She won't be able to hurt anyone else now," David said, setting down the paper. His voice wasn't triumphant. It was simply at peace. "Do you think it's over?" I asked. He looked out toward the sea, the same sea that had carried our grief and our hope for years. For her, maybe. For us, it's just beginning. In the months that followed the foundation he created, the Joyce Ann O'Brien Foundation began to take shape. Its mission was simple but powerful: to help grandparents raising grandchildren, to give them legal, financial, and emotional support, so no one had to choose between love and survival the way I once had. The company, now rebranded as O'Brien Homes, partnered with local governments to build affordable housing communities, designed with dignity gardens, childcare centers, safe spaces for families who had been through hard things. Danny's veterinary clinic opened beside one of these communities, providing low-cost pet care to elderly residents and single parents. I watched my grandsons work side by side, one drawing up blueprints and contracts, the other bandaging paws and comforting frightened animals. Between them, they'd transform the curse of abandonment into a cycle of care. A year after Sarah's arrest, we returned to the cemetery where this story began. But this time, we came not with grief, but gratitude. It was Michael's birthday, and David carried a bottle of his father's favorite whiskey. He poured a small measure over the grass. "For Dad," he said quietly. The boys stood taller than the headstone now men, where children had once clung to my skirt. The autumn wind blew through the trees, but it felt different than before, softer somehow. "He'd be proud," Danny said, arranging the flowers we'd brought. "Of what we built, of what we became." "I know he would," I replied. "You've both honored him in the best way possible by choosing love over bitterness." David stood silently for a while, then smiled through his tears. "I told him about the foundation," he said, "about the families we've helped, about you living in his house again." That foundation had already changed dozens of lives. 43 grandparents now had legal custody of their grandchildren without losing their homes. 20 families lived in new houses built by O'Brien Homes. Hundreds of pets stayed with their owners thanks to Danny's clinic. But beyond the numbers, it was the letters that moved me most: handwritten notes from grandparents, parents, and children, thanking us for giving them a chance to stay together. Each letter reminded me that Michael's legacy had grown roots far beyond our family. What Sarah had tried to destroy love had rebuilt tenfold. Later that evening, as we ate dinner on the beach house deck, I asked about Sarah's upcoming trial. "Her lawyers are pushing for a plea deal," David said, "but the charges are federal. She'll serve time." I stared out at the horizon where the sea met the sky, feeling both sorrow and relief. "Do you think she understands now what she lost?" I asked. Danny thought for a moment before answering. "She understands what she gave up," he said. "But I don't think she ever understood what she had. Some people mistake possessions for love until both are gone." David nodded. "For a long time, I hated her. That hatred drove me to build everything. But now, I just pity her. She traded everything that mattered for things that didn't. That's punishment enough. His words echoed in the quiet between waves. Sometimes growth looks like forgiveness, not the kind that excuses the past, but the kind that frees you from living inside it. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was forwarded through David's lawyer, handwritten on prison stationery, signed with shaky penmanship. Sarah wanted to write to us. Probably a legal tactic, David said cautiously, her lawyer's way of softening her image. Maybe Danny replied, but maybe she finally means it. When I opened the letter, I expected manipulation. Instead, I found something else, humility. She wrote about therapy sessions in prison, about nights haunted by dreams of 2 little boys calling for a mother who never came. She admitted she had mistaken money for worth independence for freedom and pleasure for peace. Joyce gave my children the love I was too selfish to give, she wrote. She became the mother I should have been. I can't undo what I did, but I finally understand what I threw away. The letter ended with a single line that made me set it down and cover my mouth with trembling hands. Please tell them their mother finally learned what love actually means. We sat together on the porch that night, reading it under the soft hum of the old lamp. David was the first to speak. "Do you believe her?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "I don't think it matters," I said. "Whether she means it or not, she's right about one thing. It's too late to be the mother you needed, but it's never too late for truth." Danny nodded slowly. "And it's never too late for forgiveness, even if there's no reconciliation." I spent that night writing a letter of my own, not to Sarah, but to Michael. I told him everything, how his sons had grown into men of honor, how his house and his company were alive again, and how the love he left behind had outlasted every betrayal. I wrote about how pain, when carried with purpose, can turn into something beautiful. When I sealed the envelope and placed it in the old box where I kept the letters I used to write him after his death, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. 5 years later, I stood on the same pier where Michael once taught David to fish. The ocean glittered in morning light, and beside me, David's own son held a tiny rod in his hands. "Just like your daddy once did," I whispered, and David smiled. The cycle had come full circle. Sarah's choices had nearly broken us, but in the end, they had forced us to become stronger, more compassionate, more intentional. The house she sold for money had become a haven for families in need. The sons she abandoned had built their lives around helping others. And I, the grandmother who once feared she was too old to start again, had witnessed love resurrect a legacy. Justice, I've learned, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about love that endures longer than pain, about family that rebuilds itself from ashes, about choosing kindness over bitterness, even when every wound tempts you toward vengeance. Michael's dream had come true not through wealth but through heart. And as I watched the next generation cast a fishing line into the waves, I finally understood some inheritances can't be bought or sold. They live in the choices we make and the love we pass on. If you've stayed with me until this moment, thank you for listening to our story. If it moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what love to you truly means. I'd love to read your thoughts and stories, too.